Hi, everyone. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver, and welcome to our program on Inauguration to Earth Day, Implications of the Biden-Harris Administration's Climate Policy in the First 100 Days. For those of us who've been advocating much more aggressive action to combat climate change, this is an auspicious moment. President Biden has made combating climate change a priority, built a strong climate team in his administration, rejoined the Paris Accords, issued a parade of executive orders, proposed a massive jobs and infrastructure bill, many components of which are climate friendly. And later this week, we'll host a climate summit at the White House aimed at reinvigorating the global effort to combat climate change and restoring American leadership in the climate space. How significant are these moves? What has Biden accomplished to date? How much more needs to be done? And what are the prospects? With me to discuss these questions today are two very well-connected experts and longtime observers of climate policy. Vicki Patton is General Counsel at the Environmental Defense Fund, one of the most influential environmental NGOs in the United States, and leads its U.S. Clean Air program. For over 30 years, she has worked to secure landmark national and state protections addressing climate and air pollution, participated in numerous successful climate and clean air cases to protect human health and the environment, and testified before congressional and state legislative committees. Welcome, Vicki. And Tim Profeta is the director of Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. Profeta's interests areas of expertise include climate change, energy policy, and the Clean Air Act. His work at the Nicholas Institute has included numerous legislative and executive branch proposals to mitigate climate change and work on facilitating climate and energy policy design processes for several U.S. states. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
We'll have a conversation amongst ourselves here at the beginning, but all of you in the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will certainly save time at the end for your questions. Let me start with you, Vicki. From the environmental community's point of view, just how much of a setback were the last 4 years for U.S. and indeed world efforts to combat climate change?
Well, first, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this timely and important discussion. The Trump administration's attack on public health and the environment was extensive and unprecedented and relentless. And there was a lot of attention devoted to the kind of sweeping rollbacks of the Obama era policies. It went far beyond that. There was an attack on really the very foundations of our nation's environmental laws, the science upon which it is based, the economics that it depends upon, and also affirmative policies that were quite corrupt, that were designed to promote high polluting solutions that were manifestly flawed in that they were economically irrational and very devastating in terms of public health and environment. So it was hugely damaging 4 years. And the only silver lining of that is that they cut so many corners, and they had such a disregard for the law, for science and economics, that many of their actions have proven to be lacking in durability and have been struck down in the court of law and have been really repudiated in also the court of public opinion. The damage could have been far worse had that not been the case, had they acted in a way that was anchored in law and science. They did not. So much of what they've done has been overturned. The Biden administration made kind of addressing those attacks a really important day one priority. And so you've seen kind of the executive order that the Biden-Harris team laid out on day one. It is accompanied with 104 actions by 10 different agencies to correct those rollbacks. So it's all spelled out in a lot of detail to make sure that in addition to springing forward to protect human health and the environment, that our nation really address the damage that was done. And of course, we've lost 4 precious years. And you think about the climate crisis, 4 years lost is really damaging.
Yeah, so it's not just the actions, but also the lost time.
Totally lost time. Yeah.
No, Tim, as Vicki was saying, most of the actions taken by the Trump administration were the form of executive actions of various kinds. You headed or co-chaired a commission that looked at executive actions and the possibilities of executive actions and issued a report, Climate 21 report, that laid out a host of actions that you recommended the Biden administration take. Have they taken your advice? How are they doing in terms of taking the steps that you think that you were advocating for?
Well, first, thank you, Fritz, for holding this important conversation, and it's always an honor to be with Vicki. If we get to questions of environmental law, usually I just call Vicki on the phone to ask her. So here I can just do it in public forum. So as I really like the way Vicki portrayed the last 4 years. The biggest damage, I think, was the pause, the 4-year pause. It could have been much worse, but for the lack of durability of some of these actions. I think a lot of things were taken by executive order, and even the regulations that the Trump administration put in place have been legally suspect because of them cutting corners. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to act quickly under the authorities that the government already has. So one of the way I think of what the Biden administration is doing is sort of 3 things. One is they're taking a whole of government approach to climate change. The executive order that was released on January 27th, I would recommend to everybody, if you want to see how comprehensive this approach is. It is a laundry list of actions, most of them required to be completed within 90 to 120 days. So we're just kind of coming around the corner to this first phase where the plans and the actions are going to start kind of flooding forward from the Biden administration. That whole of government approach is what we advocate in the Climate 21 project you noted. And I think you have to say we're relatively pleased that a lot of those recommendations are being put forth, and not just the core ones and the very important ones that where in EPA regulations and the like, but really a whole of government approach. What I think Biden's trying to do is infuse the whole government with the objective and the mission of addressing climate change. So in the USDA, there may be a bank created to pay farmers to basically harvest carbon. They've brought back the rules in the Department of Justice that allows people to settle cases so that they can move the needle on climate change. In the Treasury Department, all of a sudden, we're going to look at whether investors need to have carbon risk, climate risk disclosed to them as they think about investing in companies that are kind of at risk from the changes that we're going to see from climate change. And that whole government approach, I think, is the first thing I think the Biden administration is doing across. The second thing of the 3 would be the Biden administration really has an investment agenda. You see the American Jobs Plan come out. That money is flooding to solve the crises that the president identified in his campaign. So it is flooding to create the infrastructure we need to bring in clean technology to solve the climate issue. It also is going to make sure that money is deployed equitably. And I think the number will be 40% of it at least will be bringing benefits to communities that are vulnerable and need it the most. But that investment agenda is at a scale that we haven't seen in this generation and could really enable the climate transition that the president is asking for. And then the third thing is a regulatory agenda to use the authorities he has quickly and decisively to address the climate crisis. And I would point to 3 rulemakings and related sort of political and legal activity. The project to get the car rules back quickly and the California's authority to do it well established to push the envelope, to clean our vehicle fleet. The authority to control the leaking of methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and the authority to require that our power plants become cleaner and in the president's objective net zero by 2035. And I think the power plants is an incredibly important sector, because what you have to realize is that the transition we see happening means that we electrify most everything that we can, so vehicles and buildings, and that is going to be wonderful for climate change as long as we're not releasing greenhouse gases out of our power plants.
Right. Well, let me pick up. You covered a lot of territory there. Let me pick up on the jobs infrastructure bill and the investment piece of it that you mentioned here. And maybe Vicki, you could comment. I mean, to what extent is that legislation, which is primarily framed around infrastructure, ultimately better understood, at least in part, as a climate bill or climate plan? And how significant is this? Do you agree with Tim's assessment that this is really a big deal?
I do, and it's. I think it's really compelling in all of its features. It's about bringing real world benefits to the communities who have been left behind and who can be just a vital part of this really important moment. There's a moment of economic opportunity and job opportunity that the Biden-Harris team has done just a really important sort of effort in elevating, and that is real. And we've got to ensure that it reaches our rural communities, and we've got to ensure that it reaches urban communities, so that there's no community left behind as part of this economic opportunity. And if you just look at the investments, for example, in clean transportation, $174 billion proposed, that would create consumer incentives, that would help manufacturing communities by helping them to retool and rebuild so that they are, building the component parts of zero-emitting vehicles, and importantly, in innovating and retooling so that all of those jobs in the future, we have a real shot at them in our own country. Right now, we're losing those jobs to China and Europe. And then also, of course, building the charging infrastructure. At the same time, we're ensuring that every family in every community has access to broadband. It's a really comprehensive and inclusive vision, one that is long overdue in America, and one that is not about Republicans or Democrats. This is an all-American strategy.
No, of course, it's not a done deal yet, and has to get through the Congress, and maybe we can come to the politics of this later. I'm just curious, as you assume that in large measure what is being proposed actually comes into law. How fast a transition? Let's take the transportation sector. I mean, how quickly might we get to a largely electric transport vehicle fleet? How fast is this going to drive things?
I think investments, public investments, private sector investments, but paired with pollution standards, we can get there far faster than we think. At the end of January, General Motors announced that it has a vision to have all of its new vehicles be zero emitting, to eliminate all of its emissions from its new vehicles by 2035. And Ford and GM alone, just over the last few months, have announced a $50 billion investment in these advanced zero-emitting vehicles. Battery costs are plummeting. We're going to be at a moment where families are going to just be putting lots of money in their pockets and driving zero-emitting vehicles. We need to ensure that that includes the freight sector as well, because we're seeing the same kind of innovation and opportunity in the freight sector, with Ford announcing an e-cargo van just a few months ago that is all electric, zero emitting, and at a price point I think no one thought was possible even a year or two ago. This is going to be a rapid transformation. Former Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu has a slide that's really compelling, where he shows at the turn of the 1900s, when it's a picture of New York City, and it shows all horse and buggies and one motor vehicle. And then it just, a dozen years later, all motor vehicles, one horse and buggy. These transformations, I think it's going to happen fast. It's up to all of us to help make it happen. It's, we shape history, we advocate for history. So all hands on deck in trying to make it happen. I think it can happen fast.
It's fascinating because I think for many years now, there's been a sense in this country that we can't do things, or that things don't happen fast and move fast. And so, yeah, we're not accustomed to the idea anymore that certainly government policy might actually have a pretty fast and profound impact. But that's the ambition here. Tim, I'm wondering, you want to comment on this, and then I'm curious just on the regulatory piece, where you see, the big changes potentially happening.
Oh, absolutely. But just on this, I think the moment for this electrification of transportation is upon us more than the general public really appreciates now. There's a lot of apprehension about the infrastructure, the charging, the ability to make sure you have a place to charge your car. That's been, even in the last 4 years, there's been significant efforts in the states and through groups like Electrify America to get that charging infrastructure out there and deployed. And I think with the companies coming behind marketing the existence of and the ease of being able to use electric vehicles, I think this could happen quickly. And I like to think that if something's going to be durable, we really need to make sure that the industry and the private sector is behind it as well. Because once the private sector is invested in the change, it's much more difficult to reverse it, because that's where the investment-backed expectations are in our capitalist society. So I think we're kind of at a precipice on this, and I think, as Vicky said, it will take a lot of us working hard. It'll take a regulatory backbone to make sure it happens. But I do think we're kind of at that precipice. In terms of the regulatory agenda, I did sort of foreshadow. There's 3 rulemakings I'm really watching carefully out of the federal government, but there's hundreds of rulemakings that can happen, and that's kind of the whole government approach. So the first thing is to know that there are things that can happen in almost every authority across. What HUD does in terms of how it rebuilds houses, in terms of its energy efficiency investments, is going to be important. What the Justice Department does in terms of its policies to settle cases, like I said, are going to be important. The 3 regulatory big levers, I think, that I'm watching right now are the power plants to cars and the methane, with other stationary sources coming behind. So other big sources, other big power plants, other smokestacks on the horizons coming behind. The power plant rule will be a revisitation of the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act that the Obama administration tried to deploy under its Clean Power Plan, was rolled back by the Trump administration. The day before President Biden took office, the second highest court in the country struck down the Trump rule. Not only did that, said that the way that Trump read the statute was just wrong, and kind of reestablished the ability of the government to read it the more aggressive way that the Obama administration had done it. Now, there still sits a 6-3 Supreme Court who may question that ruling, and I think it's going to be a very complex equation to figure out how to work with the power plant and the Clean Air Act. But I also want to point out that's not the only rulemaking that will affect the power plants. The power plants are. We just did an assessment of the opportunities in North Carolina. The market is almost there. As Vicky said, the technologies, the battery, the storage is almost there to price parity. So you can use zero carbon energy of all sources at the same price comparison point as fossil fuel and greenhouse gas emitting sources. So just the right regulatory interventions can probably get you where you want to on the transition to the power sector. And I think that's not just a greenhouse gas rule. That is rules on ozone and coal and et cetera, they all actually can also affect the transition sector. I'll just quickly note the other two rulemakings. The Clean Cars rule is there. There's a ruling that's come down any day now, as we were talking about before the call, likely reestablishing, clearly California's right to push the frontier under the Clean Air Act on clean cars. And then the interim rule on clean cars will come down in July. But then there'll be a next generation rule of where else can we go? And that is an authority that's pretty well determined in the Clean Air Act, that the government has a right to push for greenhouse gas reductions from those cars. In fact, the original Supreme Court case establishing the government's authority was under the title of the Clean Air Act that deals with cars. And lastly, the methane rule. And we also sometimes don't think of methane, but the methane that leaks out of our pipes, that leaks out of our systems, is a very powerful greenhouse gas. And there was a pretty aggressive rule at the end of the Obama administration to reestablish, to demand that those leaks be controlled. That's an important rule to get reestablished. There is a congressional debate about it, but also in that day one executive order, a call by September to look and reestablish that rule. Those would be the three big ones I'd look at, but again, 3 of hundreds.
Well, it's already a lot. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is a big week for climate action. There's a summit coming up at the White House with, I guess, certainly a global focus, but it's also a moment when the administration, I think, will be making certain commitments in relation to the Paris Accords, et cetera. Vicki, you've been involved, I think, in EDF, and many actors have been involved in conversations with the administration about what should happen and what will happen at that summit. What do you see happening this week?
Well, it's a historic week, and I think when you reflect on the journey to get to this moment, it's important to recognize the young people who have really over the last year created important sort of leadership and momentum in creating the conditions for the world to be here. Young people who were, really saying it's untenable, that we're not addressing the climate crisis, and they need to keep holding everyone accountable and keep pushing. And those are the conditions that I think helped create a moment where you had a president who was, for the first time in American history, elected because his commitment to climate action, and steps into office with a mandate to lead. So it's a really important week, and a week where we'll see world leaders gather, and a couple of things to watch for. One, kind of the ongoing sort of dialogue and negotiations with China. We got a strong indicator of that over the weekend when the joint statement with China and the US was negotiated and made public. It's on the Department of State's website. I popped it up in my Twitter feed over the weekend, so you can find it easily. And it suggests that there's some progress there. We have obviously an enormous amount of additional work to do. And then I think the US has to reestablish credibility. And Tim has thought about this so deeply, so I'm eager to hear his thoughts, and also from the audience, just how do we do that as a country? I think it's not going to happen overnight. I think it's going to take time, and it's got to be sustained leadership, authentic leadership, and we've got to lead in all of the ways that Tim sort of laid out in this comprehensive approach. And more. We have to continue the private sector leadership. We need to continue the state and local government innovation and leadership and proof points. We really need all hands on deck, and we need those young people to continue to demand action and hold the leaders accountable.
Well, I'll turn to Tim on this. I mean, the U.S. Obviously, the gap of inaction that we talked about at the outset was more than that, in terms of U.S. withdrawing from the Paris Accords and withdrawing from our traditional leadership role in the international arena. Rhetorically, we're back. But I guess the question then is are other countries willing and to trust us again, or to engage fully with us at this point?
It's just, I would just say, like any other relationship where trust gets eroded, it takes time and proof to rebuild the trust all the way. I think there is a willingness in the world. The world knows they need United States leadership on this issue. We are the largest economy. We've driven change for societal change across the world in so many ways, in so many different times. The world, I think, is willing to embrace the US re-entry into climate solutions. But I'll tell you, if you go to a UN negotiation, I think international negotiators now may know more about Senate procedure than most Americans. They know how hard it is to pass legislation in this country. They know more about our divide electoral politics than most Americans, and they know how difficult. So there definitely will be a trust but verify, moment here for our ability to regain climate leadership. And that's, I think, a little what Vicki said. That's why it's not just the leadership of the executive branch of the US government. We need to see our companies coming forward and investing in a transition and creating that durability because of that, the expectations that we're going to do this. We need our state and our local governments that have led so ably in the last decade to keep doing it. I don't think when we worked on legislation 15 years ago, we thought, well, the states will push us and then the federal government will take over. That's no longer the case. The states are partners in this, and they need to keep pushing for the change that they've wrought in all the aggressive actions they've taken. But so I think the world will invite us back to the table. They're glad we're back at the table, and they're going to try and hold us to it. And will only trust us, I think, once we show sort of all these other factors that it's not just one political party's leadership that's saying we're going to do this, but actually you can see US society and US economy embracing this change.
So a couple of things to follow up. Vicki, you mentioned the negotiations with China. And of course, China now is the largest greenhouse gas emitter, having passed the US and blown by us. Rhetorically, they made a commitment to be carbon neutral by, I think, 2060, to peak at 2030 in its carbon emissions. There was certainly the agreements this weekend. But there's also concern out there that China continues to build coal plants, remains pretty committed to coal. So I'm curious, both of you, actually, your take on where we really are in terms of US-China cooperation in combating climate change.
The statement over the weekend doesn't address, the coal plant build out. It does speak to the importance of climate finance to really help ensure that we, as a world, the world together, and certainly the US and China invest in trying to enable developing countries to invest in clean technologies, clean energy. And part of this opportunity and part of what will help us get there is just the fact that these technologies are outcompeting, right? We're at this magical moment. Just here in Colorado in the last few weeks, Xcel Energy unveiled a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by over 85% by 2030. And that's significant. That's a big step forward. And that's what we need to enable sort of all of the end use electrification. So, there's, I think, a lot of ongoing work to still do in China and in the US to make progress. And a big part of what we'll be watching this week is what is the commitment that the US government makes under the Paris Climate Accord, this we call the nationally determined contribution. And is that ambitious, and will we deliver on that? And will we back it up with the actions that are needed? And that's also how we make progress in China, right? By racing ahead and demonstrating kind of the race to that economic opportunity that is real and that we all see, and that China is going to it will be catalytic in China if we can demonstrate it.
Well, let me pick up on that NDC, the nationally determined contribution, which, as I guess part of rejoining Paris, we have to announce a new target. Is it by 2030?
Yeah.
And I don't know. So first question is, what is that going to be? How ambitious do you expect that target to be? And the follow-up will be, what is it going to take to get there? I don't know. Tim,
I'll take it. I'll take it.
I have a little poll here. What is the number?
All right. I'll lead with my guess. The baseline, the minimal sort of acceptable number everybody says like 50% by 2030. So I bet you it's 50x%. They'll like get a little sort of fudge factor over and say we overperformed. So the way that Paris was constructed somewhat brilliantly, given the failure of the Kyoto, where we kind of top down, everybody take a target, was more through peer pressure of countries saying, how far can you go? And sort of from the bottom up, bringing all these targets and contributions. So we had a target, which was a 26 to 28% reduction by 2025 when we entered Paris. We've now lost 4 years, and on reentry, we need to have a new one for 2030. And that's what should be announced this week. And the question is how much detail we get with analyze. Good friends of both Vicki and mine are working really hard, really long hours, trying to figure out what they can promise based on all these authorities we're talking about. What can they actually promise? And so I think you'll see something that's over 50%, but only slightly. And I think the magic of this will be, can we actually deliver on it? Like Vicki said, that trust gap is there. And so they'll hear us, but they'll also be comparing to what authorities they have and their really refined knowledge of our legislative and executive processes, and try and hold the US's feet to the fire to actually hit the target that they propose.
Vicki, you see, you're betting on 50x as well, and then the follow-up is really the point Tim just made, which is being able to make good on that. And the real question in my mind is, we've talked about a lot of things that are in the works, but I mean, is that going to get us there? I mean, I think it's hard for people to understand what a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions really means in terms of the structure of our economy. But first 50x, and then how do we get there?
At least 50%, and I think we can get there. And it's important how we get there, right? A big part of this moment is addressing the systemic inequities in America, racial injustice, economic injustice. We can't get there without also ensuring that every family, every school, every community has clean water to drink. That's part of how we get there, right? We can't get there without ensuring that the communities that have been suffering for far too long, the inequitable, unjust burden of pollution, that they're not protected. And the importance of some of the sectors that Tim mentioned, some of those big polluting sectors, not only are they major sources of climate pollution, they're also sources of deadly particles and smog forming contaminants and toxic contaminants. And so coming up with the solutions that eliminate all of the pollutants from those sectors and more is an opportunity to really ensure that we are delivering for all Americans, especially addressing the urgent crisis of environmental injustice and ensuring that no community is left unprotected in making sort of this progress. So climate progress has to be centered in equity, both environmental justice and economic equity. And that is this moment. And that's why those investments are so important, paired with those meaningful pollution standards and the accountability, right? How do we ensure that we reimagine a clean air system that gives the public the trust and the confidence that they can believe that those industrial emitters are actually being held accountable, and they believe that their government officials are delivering on this moment? And that's on all of us, right? We've got to reimagine a world where we have better monitoring, We've got to reimagine a world where we're far more transparent and accountable in delivering on outcomes that matter to people's lives. So it's about making climate progress anchored in justice.
That in some sense involves us all, and as individuals, as citizens, it involves state, local governments, et cetera. I do want, though, to just, before leaving it, we've talked about the what is possible under the regulatory authority that already exists. We talked about the infrastructure, jobs build, and the investment side of things. I guess the further question, though, is, are there legislative actions that will need to happen if we are to get to 50x reductions? You both know well, in the first year of the Obama administration, the focus was on cap and trade, major legislation, long conversations about that, the possibilities of carbon tax. Are there legislative actions that are needed beyond the infrastructure bill in order to get us to where we need to go? And you can see the corollary question is really about the politics of this and what is possible there. And I don't know who wants to take that. Tim, you spent some time in the Senate. You know that landscape pretty well. What do you think?
The first thing I'll say is that the scale of the challenge here really requires legislative action. We need to find our way politically to get there. In this Congress, I think the most important thing we can do is this investment agenda. I never say never on things, and I think there are some proposals that might be able to draw the bipartisan support necessary. But I think it's very difficult for me to see an aggressive carbon pricing bill, that sort of thing, go through the Congress, and I think it would be unfair for me to express optimism otherwise. I think the politics of this are very malleable. I think Vicki and I have both met with this completely sufficient amount of Republican leaders that know this is real and needs it to be addressed. That should the tribalism of our politics wane on this issue, I think we could get there again surprisingly quickly. But where we are postured right now, I don't see a major piece of legislation being passed through this Congress. You will hear one last thing, and Secretary of Energy Granholm commented in the press the other day that perhaps they could do a clean energy standard, a standard that requires a percentage of the energy generated by all power producers and distributors to be clean, to be zero carbon. Perhaps they could do that through the budget processes that avoid the filibuster and mean you only have to have a majority of the Senate to pass it. Mm-hmm. I hope I am wrong, but I am very skeptical about whether that can pass the parliamentary hurdles it needs to do. And I actually think in the end, this is something we could pass with a sufficient majority to make it durable. Particularly couple it with society moving at the same time and investment going to clean energy. I think you'll find yourself in a position where a wise, economically well thought out, equitably well thought out set of proposals for this transition could pass with bipartisanship, and that would be a more durable, better way to find our way forward on climate.
That's great, and I'm going to turn to the audience questions in just a second now. But Vicki, I'd love your thoughts on this.
I think Tim's right, and the opportunity to move legislation is really centered, I think, especially in the power sector, where we've made a lot of progress as a country. There's tremendous opportunity. We've got advanced technologies that can deliver, and there's a lot of, I think, in all regions of the country, power companies, rural electric co-ops, municipal power providers, that are delivering these solutions and that support these solutions. And it would be tremendous, and it should be a priority to do all we can to move legislation to provide kind of the stability and the certainty to ensure that those investments are lasting, and that we reduce and really decarbonize the power sector. It unlocks, it's the linchpin for making progress and addressing climate pollution in all of these other sectors. We need, clean freight and trucks and clean cars that are plugging into clean power. So clean power is really sort of the fulcrum.
It is, because you're really trying to electrify the transport system so that it then becomes dependent on, it really matters how you generate that power, doesn't it? Well, let me turn to this. I love the conversation. I can monopolize it. I have been so far. Let me turn to questions. We have a number of questions from the audience, and we'll get to as many as we can. Sally Isaacson asks, what is the impact of the loss of so many scientists and other experts that were fired or resigned from the many agencies during the Trump years? Permanent damage? Fixable?
No, not permanent, but a really wise question. But when we were doing this Climate 21 project that you referred to, we spent 18 months interviewing experts who had served in government, and really kind of just framing the question: if you were in January 2021 with the president wanted to act, how would you act? And there was a flood of amazing ideas, but what became really, really apparent was that there also was a human capital crisis, that we had lost so many people, and the people that were so demoralized that we're working on climate change, that you could have the best ideas in the world, but for the agriculture department, but there was no extension officials to go out and actually work with the farmers on it. It was just an idea on a piece of paper somewhere. And so we actually did one last memo on the Climate 21 project. It was all about staffing and how you could staff quickly and how you could bring talent to the challenge quickly. And I think in that is incredible opportunity. They left a lot of vacancies. They can be filled. And there's a call to action at this moment on this issue for young people to come in and be servants of their world and help fix this problem. And I think one of the things that this administration do is really try and bring talent to the topic as soon and as much as they can. And I think that is actually a generational opportunity beyond this moment in time. Some of the most talented people I knew in the federal government were servants who came in the 70s and 80s when the environmental movement started and really served this country for decades. And we've kind of started to lose that generation. And this is an ability to bring in a new, ambitious, excited generation to help with this transition at this moment in time. I think that's a great opportunity actually we have from the problem of the vacancies and the hollowed out government.
I love that, and it's a great advertisement for our new master's program here at the Corbell School.
Yeah, at the Corbell School, you can be trained for this too. Yeah,
absolutely, I think it's extraordinary. In the lifetime of our students, this issue is going to be absolutely central, and it's a great issue to work on.
I would just add, I think, Sally, I really appreciate the question. And the Biden-Harris administration has proposed in its new budget request to address some of that. So that's part of this. In the kind of landmark climate executive order that the president issued, it provides for a climate conservation corps that gets at the heart of what Tim just described. And that is long overdue. And I would love to have one in Colorado. Let's work on one in Colorado. Let's get it in place. Let's create the Colorado Climate Conservation Corps and support the next generation of young people who will kind of lead the way and transcend sort of all of the political partisanship and find kind of people who have this experience that they can lead for generations to come. So let's do it here in Colorado. Let's get it going.
All right, it's a deal. Let's work on that.
Okay.
Bhavan Dinda has a question about public transportation, especially train connectivity, and what are the challenges that you see for a robust public transportation system? Not, I'm going to pick on one of you. All right, Vicki.
It's really important, and it's part of the president's American Jobs Plan, and also just a priority of the president's leadership team is investing in kind of all modes of transportation. We really need to reimagine what public transportation looks like, how we deliver freight, and how we create livable communities. And so we've got an enormous amount of work to do. You think about just this region, there's an urgent need for us to kind of take a step forward. Just look at the development, along the Front Range. And this is going to be a mega city, a mega region, as you look over the horizon. And if we don't find really additional ways and additional investments in transportation that help serve, all of the Front Range from Fort Collins to Pueblo, we're missing a huge and urgent need. So totally agree. And let's keep working on it. It's got to be a priority.
Let me just add two thoughts. One, I want to associate myself with everything that you said, but yeah, I love the metaphor that there's no silver bullet to climate change or silver buckshot. It's just you've got it's across the sectors, across the solutions, and we need it all, right? And this is something we also have, I think the one thing about public transit I think will be passing, but is, we have the pandemic has created concerns about it, and we need to really, I think, tackle that directly and help people feel comfortable with public as it exits the pandemic. I don't think we all know how we'll all feel about what we do in shared public space after this pandemic, but I think we need to make sure we can provide the reassurance so people will have confidence in those things. And also, the last point I'd make is this pandemic also has some other very positive lessons for us. I think we don't always have to get in our car and go to another box to work anymore. We've learned that we can find other ways to connect and work that may require less demand of energy and demand of pollution.
Yeah. Let me, in the interest of time, move on to some other questions. Thomas Meredith asks, as an international student, I would like to know why the U.S. must reclaim its leadership role. Why do you think the U.S. must take a leadership role and not fall in line and cede leadership to other countries? Are we the indispensable nation? Is it still the case that absent U.S. leadership, or was it ever the case that absent U.S. leadership, things don't happen?
I guess, I think we're just let's go first in alternation, and then I'll go first, and I think there's wisdom in the question. There is so much that's happened through the leadership of Europe and through the leadership of some of the Asian nations even now. A lot of what's happened with the pricing of renewables that we're talking about isn't happening actually exclusively in the United States. That innovation has occurred overseas but really helped globally. That said, the United States is still arguably the dominant economy. And so in doing so, it's at least one of the two major economies. And in doing so, it can really push the accelerator on a lot of what we want to have happen if we put our shoulder behind the wheel. Particularly because the other dominant economy, China, and we are kind of juxtaposed. And this weekend's announcement's very, very exciting, but I think that we move better together than we do in opposition to each other. And lastly, I'll say something just slightly cynical and about my own country is that the best way to appeal to American to act is to remind an American that he or she is an exceptional American. And so some form of flattery to the country may make us think that we are exceptional and required to act, and then we will act because we'll be answering the call.
Mm-hmm. I would just add, and Thomas, thank you for that important question, that the U.S. is still the second largest emitter in the world. We discharge 15% of global climate pollution, and we are still the largest legacy emitter. And so I believe we have a moral responsibility, a duty to be leaders and to take responsibility for our mess, for the pollution that we're discharging, and it is convergent with a tremendous economic opportunity that I think can really advance equity and economic prosperity. And I also worry about, the most vulnerable people here and all across the world who are going to be suffer the greatest harms from climate chaos. And so we do need to act. We need to step up.
A question from my colleague Cullen Hendricks here, who's written extensively on this topic. So how do you grade the Biden administration's efforts to address the national security implications of climate change so far?
Oh, you take that, Tim.
Incomplete. Cullen, I'll give them an I, because I don't think they've done, as I sort of said at the beginning, so many of these processes are just in their inception, and they're in the 90 to 120 day review periods, and it's really unfair to grade them too much at this point. They have put some things in place, that structurally to make sure the issue is represented. I don't feel like I'm talking to Cullen, because I'm sure he knows this, right? But I'm talking to others. There is the representation in the National Security Council where there was never before of climate change through the Kerry positions, Secretary Kerry's position. The Pentagon has a secretarial level climate advisor for the first time as I can recall, and the Secretary of Defense has been announcing focal areas looking at the national security implications, the global threat of climate change and some of their planning. But these are at rhetorical level, and I think the devil will be in the details when we see how it affects the policy of the United States, when we see how it affects some of those sort of first, crucible moments where national security implications of climate could push one way or another. And as far as I'm aware, we don't really have that moment yet.
Mila Nickel, my apologies if I've mispronounced your name. Vicki, good question for you. How vulnerable are Biden's actions to court challenges?
Thank you, Mila, for that question. The composition of the U.S. Supreme Court has changed in a very significant way. And so I think it's going to be really important that they take actions that are anchored in the plain language of the statute, that they take actions that are where the societal benefits overwhelm the costs, and that are look like and are consistent with all of the actions that administrative agencies, expert agencies have taken for the past 50 years in Republican and Democratic administrations alike. So it's a really important point. They've got to be really thoughtful, and this also relates to the business support. Tim just mentioned how the business investments are so important in kind of securing durable policy. Judges are also people, and when judges see business support, it helps judges understand that these are solutions that are very viable. And so it's also these business investments and the business leadership, and there's been this just tremendous coalition of businesses that have been really full-throated in the last several days in calling for the U.S. to adopt a really ambitious global commitment to addressing climate pollution. That is just, we need more of that, all of that as well, because that will also help us design policies that are durable in light of judicial review. The risks, the legal risks are going to be, there'll be a lot of people that will litigate, and And I think part of one of the things we need to figure out, Millen, is, and would love your thoughts about this, how do we hold accountable the obstructionists, the entities who are just not because they really think the policy is flawed. Got to figure out how to do that, and unfortunately there will be a lot of that over the next few years.
The question, you both mentioned the role of industry in a kind of positive way, investment in terms of building momentum in support of climate change. This question's from Aaron Fels is, how can you deal with outsized industry influence on the regulatory process? How do you make sure that corporations, friends, polluters aren't dictating policy actions? So to what extent is the private sector or elements of it continue to be a block on action? This, Tim, I'll toss that one to you.
I mean, the private sector, I mean, I think when you hear Vicki and my general optimism about the trajectory in the private sector, there's a really good grounding of it, but the private sector is not a single entity. Right. It is an ecosystem of influences, and there, of course, will be those who are not interested in the transition that will find ways to fight it. How do we prevent their voices? I actually think changing the balance within the sector itself may be one of the most powerful ways. If you look at what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has said recently on climate, if you just look at what groups like the Business Roundtable have said on climate recently, there has been a shift in the dialogue, and making sure that we hold those sort of principal statements accountable to the execution with those same companies, with public pressure, with shareholder pressure, et cetera, is, I think, a very important part of that. And then, every private firm is a citizen in terms of the Administrative Procedures Act. They have a right to voice their opinion, but making sure that if government simply does what Vicki outlined so well, follows the traditional legal authorities they have, follows the standards. A lot of the standards that we can demand of the private sector are based on demonstration of solutions, and as the solutions are becoming more and more apparent, holding our rulemaking processes to those standards, I think there will be durable rules. There will always be countervailing voices from the private sector, but I think the balance is shifting, and I think we want to do everything we can to encourage that.
I would just add a couple of points, Aaron, and public support for climate action is at a zenith, and that is powerful. Yeah. We need you to keep raising your voice. We need to keep talking in America. We need to meet people where they're at and continue to build as much public support as we possibly can for climate action. And the young people who have done that in a transformative way, they are responsible for the shift in the private sector. When we talk to business leaders, and we work with a lot of companies, one of the things they say is they need to be leaders on climate for recruiting and retaining top employees. If they're going to be relevant to this generation of young people, they need to be leaders on climate. That you're creating the demand for climate leadership. We need to continue to do that through lots and lots of public engagement, public action, and young people continuing to lead and hold accountable. And then the investor piece is really important. One area that we haven't spent quite as much time on today that's super important, and that is that there's a whole body of actions that we anticipate will be fleshed out in the next few days, where the Biden-Harris administration will lead in calling for the private sector to be responsible in the way climate risk is managed. And that's through the Securities and Exchange Commission, that's through Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, ensuring that these risks are integrated into decision-making the Fed through banking. And this is another important sort of accountability mechanism that we all need to kind of solidify over the next few years.
Well, I am afraid we are out of time. We could go on it. There's so many topics we just touched on. Maybe we'll have to reprise this. I began by saying what an auspicious moment this is, and certainly both of your comments reinforce that notion of an extraordinary momentum. Really, in my lifetime, I think probably the most overall momentum in this space that we've seen. We'll see what happens this week with the summit and beyond. But Vicki Patton, Tim Profeta, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. And all of you in the audience, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for the opportunity. Take care.
Really
Be
great.
well.
Be well, everyone. Yes.
Thank you.